It was the year of the Transcontinental Railroad. Wall Street was an emerging financial center, and Ulysses S. Grant had just entered the White House. The Civil War that had almost destroyed the nation had, by 1869, given way to economic prosperity, and American society was alive with optimism and opportunity. Grant seemed the perfect leader for the times. A self-effacing Midwesterner, he was the hero of the Civil War, a military genius who defeated the Confederate Army in hard-won battles at Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. After 4 years of Civil War and its bitter aftermath, Americans harbored great hopes for a Grant presidency, but things didn't work out as expected.
I did not want the presidency, and have never quite forgiven
disappointment and characterized by fluctuations in luck and fortune. He grew up in Georgetown, Ohio, and after graduating from West Point in 1843 served in the Army. But while stationed in Northern California, heavy drinking got him into trouble with his commanding officer, and he resigned in 1854. By that time, he had married Julia Boggs Dent, the sister of one of his classmates at West Point. They settled near St. Louis, where he tried farming, peddling wood, and selling real estate to make ends meet. 39 and the father of 4, he was bringing home about $50 a month. Later that year, however, he found something he was good at, leading men on the battlefields of a burgeoning Civil War. Within 3 years, he was a lieutenant general commanding all the United States armies. 4 years after that, he was elected president. He was a mild-mannered commander-in-chief. Even as a general, he shunned profanity and broad displays of emotion, and most people liked him. But that didn't stop Grant from being ridiculed once the public discovered that members of his administration were attempting to get rich behind his back. In the end, 3 cabinet secretaries and 5 federal judges resigned, and both of his vice presidents, Schuyler Colfax and Henry Wilson, were implicated in fraud. Following the presidency, Grant took off 3 years before an unsuccessful bid for a 3rd term. Not long afterwards, he and Mrs. Grant settled in New York City, where a poor business investment eventually left him bankrupt. A heavy cigar smoker, he also came down with throat cancer. Broke, Grant began writing his memoirs, working tirelessly to finish them in an effort to ensure financial security for his wife before he died. He completed the manuscript on July 1st, 1885, 3 weeks before his death at age 63. Grant's memoirs would earn his family nearly $500,000 in royalties.
I never sought the presidency, nor any promotion that came to me in the Army during the war. They all came to me unsolicited, but in all positions I endeavored to do my duty as I saw it, and to give satisfaction to those who promoted or elected me. Ulysses S. Grant.
"Let us have peace" is the quote which is etched atop the General Grant National Memorial here in New York City. This is the largest mausoleum in North America, 150 feet high, overlooking the Hudson River, dedicated 102 years ago. And if you look inside, you will see the sarcophagus of our 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant. There it is on the left, and on the right, the sarcophagus of his wife, Julia Dent Grant. And daily tours are now underway here at Grant's tomb in New York City at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Today, we continue with our American President Series, Life Portraits, as we examine the life and times of our 18th President, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, we have a 2.5-hour program for you, several guests to tell you about, beginning with John Simon, who is a professor and editor of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. We will also be talking with Zianja Wilson of the National Park Service. She's going to give us a tour of this facility inside and out. Alan Ballard is with us this morning. He is a history professor at SUNY Albany, the State University of New York at Albany. He is a Civil War specialist. And we are also going to meet Ulysses Grant Dietz, the great-great-grandson of the 18th president, who also played a major role in the cleanup of this site just a couple of years ago. As always, our phone lines will be open for you to call in. If you live in the East and Central time zones, the number to call is 202-624-1111. Out West, 202-624-1115. And of course, we look forward to hearing from you in just a couple of minutes. We begin, though, with John Simon. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here. Tell us first about the quote, "Let us have peace." Where did it come from?
It was originally put on the letter that Grant wrote accepting the presidential nomination in 1868. Scrawled on at the bottom as if it were an afterthought, and it became the Republican slogan in that campaign. And it took on a life of its own as a capsule summary of what Grant meant to this country. This is the spirit in which he had fought the Civil War. This is the spirit in which he had governed as president. This is the animating force throughout his entire career, and it just seemed right for the tomb.
John Y. Simon is going to be with us for the entire 2.5-hour program this morning. We got lots to talk about. I want to give you a sense, though, of where we are. We are in Upper Manhattan in New York City, Manhattan being one of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. So we're at 122nd Street and Riverside Drive, the Hudson River being over on this side. We have some video from our vantage point here. This is the Upper West Side of New York, taken from a church, the Riverside Church, which sits just behind us this morning. Again, the George Washington Bridge there in the upper left of your screen, connecting over to New Jersey. So upstate New York is in the foreground. Behind us is Midtown Manhattan, probably about a 15-minute drive from here. And you can see there the top of Grant's tomb overlooking the Hudson River. Again, here in Upper Manhattan in New York City. And again, that shot is taken from the Riverside Church, which is just behind us. It's a multi-denominational church. A couple thousand people worship there throughout the week. And on Sundays, of course, that building was modeled after some of the French structures about 500 or 600 years ago. So that is the Riverside Church. John Simon, why New York City? Why was General and President Grant buried here?
When Grant died, there was a lot of talk about where he would be buried. He'd never been a particularly rooted person, and there was talk about West Point. There was talk about St. Louis, where he had owned a farm, and he had offered a series of speculations, but New York City wanted Grant. And Julia, who lived in New York City, wanted to be able to visit his tomb. So New York City was decided upon. The city offered a site in Central Park, but the Grant family preferred this Riverside Park site because it was off the beaten track. It was more isolated. As you can see by the traffic today, that has not been permanent.
This, of course, is a busy area of New York City, like most areas, a lot of residential areas here. And again, the Riverside Church, the Union Theological Seminary, Columbia University in this area, Yeshiva University in this area. We are going to take a tour both outside and inside the General Grant National Memorial, Grant's tomb, in about 10 or 15 minutes with a representative of the U.S. National Park Service. We're going to talk with John Simon in just a moment about Grant's early life leading up to his days at West Point. But we are going to take a call first from here in New York. Is it Busty, New York?
It's Bust-Eye, New York.
Bust-Eye, New York. Where is that?
Good morning, gentlemen. It's south of Buffalo, as far west in New York as you can get.
Gotcha. Way upstate and to the west. Go right ahead, sir.
Well, General Grant happens to be a cousin of mine on his Simpson side, but I was wondering if your historian could comment on his name change. His God-given name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, and his name was changed upon entering the academy.
Thank you. Where did the name come from?
Well, the name came from an error that was made in appointing him to the military academy. The caller is right about the name. While he was named Hiram originally with Ulysses as a middle name, his father had preferred Ulysses, called him that, and he was known as that around town. According to the traditional story, he was afraid that if he used those initials, H-U-G, he would be nicknamed Hug. So he decided to reverse his name. But in the meantime, the congressman who had appointed him, knowing that he was called Ulysses, added an S presumably for the Simpson name, and he became known as Ulysses S. Grant because the military academy insisted that he serve under the name through which he had been appointed. Later on, he would say rather forcefully that the S in his name stood for nothing. And when he was stationed out on the Pacific coast, and his second son was born in Ohio, and he learned that Julia had named that son Ulysses S. Grant Jr., he wrote back saying, "What does the S stand for in his name?" He said specifically then, it stood for nothing in his.
Tell us about his own birth. Where is he from? Who were his parents and siblings?
He was born in Ohio, in Point Pleasant. His father was a tanner. His mother was the daughter of a local farmer. It was a young couple just starting out. He was the oldest son in a family that eventually had 6 children. He had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. After about a year, the family moved to Georgetown, Ohio, and that's really where he grew up, and he was living there at the time he was appointed to the military academy.
What kind of child was he?
Well, we're not that certain about what kind of child he was. Apparently, he detested the family tannery, his father's business, which had the stink of death about it, and was located across the street from the family home, and he'd do almost anything to get away from the tannery. He'd do farm work on land that his father owned. He was familiar with horses, on very good terms with horses, would do hauling and other activities with horses.
Ulysses S. Grant, of course, went on to West Point, served in the military, of course, was the winning general in the Civil War, went on to 2 terms in the presidency. We're going to follow all of that, specifically the Civil War aspect, a bit later in this program with Alan Ballard of the State University of New York at Albany. But for now, let's take a call for John Simon from Madison, Connecticut. Thanks for hanging on. Let's take a call from Munster, Indiana instead. Munster, are you there?
Yes.
Go ahead, Munster.
Yes. My question has to do with Grant's popularity and his being reelected. Of course, Grant is known as the victorious general in the Civil War, but his presidency, I think, is often regarded as one of the most disappointing. In fact, I think your introductory segment said it could even be considered a failure, given the scandals and the financial panics that occurred during his administration. Yet in 1872, he was easily reelected. And I was wondering if you could discuss who was his opponent in 1872, Horace Greeley. I believe Greeley was chosen over Charles Francis Adams from the famous Adams presidential family. And I was wondering, was Greeley's health an issue and why Grant was so easily reelected? I understand Greeley died soon after the election.
Thank you, caller.
Also,
John Simon, why don't you begin with the election of 1868? What kind of president was he, as the caller was suggesting?
You mean during his first term?
Yes.
He was probably a better president than history records, because this is the time when he comes into office with a full head of steam, a determination to uphold Reconstruction, a determination to reform entirely the Indian policy of the United States, a determination to implement civil service reform, and with ideas in other areas as well. By 1872, he was running for re-election. He had turned 50, and some of the steam was out. And yet, as the caller mentioned, the liberal Republicans had first nominated Horace Greeley, who was a founder of the Republican Party, and this candidacy was picked up by the Democrats. It was an embarrassing candidacy for all concerned. the liberal Republicans had chosen, of the various persons discussed at the time, the very weakest candidate. And Greeley was vulnerable on a number of points, and Grant's re-election became a triumphant one with an increased popular vote majority over the one that he'd carried into the White House in his previous term.
Now, we know the country just came off the Civil War at that time. How many people lived in the U.S.? How many states were there as Grant became president?
When Grant took office, there were just under 40 million Americans. The increase even during his term is dramatic, about 10 million people, largely due to the heavy influx of people from Europe, some 300 to 400,000 persons a year arriving in this country. The number of states when he took office was 37, and when he left it was 38, thanks to the admission of Colorado, which was called the Centennial State because it was admitted in 1876.
John Simon was educated at Swarthmore College along with Harvard, where he has a PhD, currently teaches at Ohio State University and Southern Illinois University?
Southern Illinois University.
Southern Illinois now, okay, was also a professor at Ohio State. And we're going to take that call now from Madison, Connecticut. Go right ahead.
Mr. Simon.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, you can hear me. I understand now why callers have. Anyway, does the name John Lincoln Clem ring a bell with you?
Oh, yeah, Johnny Clem?
Yeah.
Right. Young boy, active in the Civil War, later a favorite in terms of promotion after the war.
You never heard that story.
Yeah.
Well, let me give you a little background.
Oh,
We're
okay.
talking about my wife's great-grandfather. And first of all, after the Battle of Shiloh, he was promoted to sergeant at the age of 10. And was made a runner for George Thomas. And as such, got to know all the top brass. He knew Sheridan and Sherman and Rosecrans, etc. After the war, the book about him and the movie about him ended. But General Thomas took him under his wing, hired a tutor, sent him to Cincinnati, which he didn't like, went back to Marietta, Ohio, finished his high school degree. Then applied and received a presidential appointment to West Point. And for 2 years, 2 generations rather, the family claimed West Point turned him down because he was so short. And a recent check of the West Point archives showed he flunked the entrance exam. But this didn't deter the little man. He headed for Washington, walked over from Union Station to the White House, cooled his heels for a couple of days, and then darted into Grant's office. Grant looked up and said, "Johnny, what the hell are you doing here?" And they told war stories for over an hour. And finally Grant said, "What can I do for you?" And the young man said he wanted to slot at West Point.
Caller, while we got you there, you want to ask a question of John Simon?
No, I just wanted to tell him why I thought Grant, here's Grant's problem. Grant had given the young man an appointment in West Point, and Grant's fellow officers said, "We don't want him."
Well, let's see if John Simon wants to add to that. Go right ahead.
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me a real question because you obviously know a whole lot more about it than I do. It's worth pointing out that of the various appointments to West Point, many of the candidates failed the entrance exam for one reason or another, and it was not considered a terrible disgrace. Of the class in which Grant graduated, half of the cadets who had actually entered had left the academy before graduation.
I wanted to ask you more about his entrance into West Point. Earlier in the program, we saw some pictures of the birth site of Ulysses S. Grant. We have some pictures now of the boyhood home, which you talked about briefly. How did he make it from a child into West Point for college and a career in the military? How did it come about?
His father was a man who, according to the neighbors, would follow a dollar to hell. He was increasingly prosperous in his tanning business. But when his son Ulysses said that he wanted more education than he received at local academies, the equivalent of high school education, And Jesse got wind of the fact that a neighbor boy had flunked out of West Point, and other people didn't know about it. Jesse saw his opportunity to get his son admitted to a place that would give a free education, and he used his connections with an Ohio congressman to wangle an appointment for his son. Then, after he got the appointment, he told Ulysses he was going to West Point. "I won't go," said Ulysses. "You will go if I want you to go," said his father. And guess what happened? He went. He went reluctantly. He was hoping on that journey to West Point that a steamboat would blow up, not to maim him permanently, but to injure him enough so that he would not be acceptable at West Point. He was reluctant about West Point from the moment he heard he had an appointment.
We are going to take one more call for John Simon, and then we're going to take a tour of the outside of Grant's tomb here in New York City. Atlanta, you've been hanging on. Go right ahead.
Yes, I have two quick questions, and I'll hang up for the answer. First of all, I know that Grant was in West Point at the same time as Stonewall Jackson was, and I was wondering if they had a friendly relationship, if they knew each other, and also, aside from Grant's memoirs, what is the best biography of Grant? I know that the McFeely book has come under some controversy by some scholars, so I'm wondering what you consider to be the best one, at least in recent years.
Thank you. Thank you, caller.
Well, as for Thomas J. Jackson, he became Stonewall during the Civil War. I think everybody who knew him at West Point admired him. He was somebody who had no advantages whatsoever in life, and entered with a very low standing, but through perseverance and determination, gradually rose in his class, and through that, Grant became his admirer, as did others. As for biographies, the biography by Jeffrey Perret is the most recent. It is a comprehensive life of Grant and does have the advantage of the use of manuscript materials that were not used by other people. For those who like old standbys and classics, there's still Bruce Catton. Bruce Catton wrote a 2-volume military history of Grant, published the first in 1960, the second in 1970. Grant moves south, Grant takes command. These are books that do not qualify as the latest on the subject, but they're darn good, and I'd recommend them.
And Dr. Simon has been editing the Grant papers, we understand, since 1962. What are the Grant papers?
This is a documentary history of Grant, in which we try to print everything of substance that he wrote, along with the correspondence to him, and present a complete picture of the Grant correspondence as we know it, as it has survived. We are up to 22 printed volumes. We are proofreading and indexing volume 23 and 24. It was believed when the project started that it could be completed in 12 volumes, and that the person who was chosen as editor would live to complete it. Well, that's going to be touch and go, because we're only up to the end of 1873. There's still more White House left, more post-war years left, and we're going to persevere. We're going to complete this set.
And we're going to talk about all of that as the 2.5-hour program continues, more about the Civil War, the presidency, the post-presidency. We do have time for just one more call before we do get that tour of the outside of Grant's tomb. Aberdeen, South Dakota, hello.
Hi. The silly question of the day for your information. As you know, there is a movie out now called The Wild Wild West that is based on the TV series from the 1960s. To those who don't know, this is about two Secret Service men who go out west but are sort of a personal soldiers of President Grant. Well, have historians ever found any basis for this?
I do remember when the Wild Wild West was on TV, and I used to get calls about, did Grant ever do this? And it would come from an episode. No, nothing in the Wild Wild West originally or in this movie has to do with a very real Ulysses Grant. But if you've been to see the movie, you know that he's played by Kevin Kline, who actually called me about a year ago to ask questions about what Grant looked like, how he behaved, what he sounded like. And I will say I'm a great Kevin Kline admirer because he took his role very seriously.
John Simon, we're going to ask you to hang around for about 10 or 15 minutes while we do a tour of the outside of Grant's tomb. And of course, we have lots more to talk about later. This is the 18th President of the United States featured today, Ulysses S. Grant. We are set up here on the plaza in front of Grant's tomb, technically called the General Grant National Memorial, here in Upper Manhattan of New York City. And Ziandra Wilson is a park ranger with the National Park Service. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. Exactly where are you standing right now?
I am in front of the monument at the steps just before you enter the building, near the columns.
Give us a sense of exactly how big this structure is and why it's so big.
Well, the monument is 150 feet in height. It was specifically designed this way, a very imposing structure, so it could be seen from miles around. And Duncan was the architect, John Duncan.
John Duncan, and who was he?
John Duncan was a New York architect. He was chosen by the Grant Monument Association. There were two contests that was held. None was chosen from the first contest. 65 entries were submitted. And then there was a second contest. John Duncan was among 5 architects that submitted designs.
Where did the design come from? Was it modeled after any particular building in this country or the world?
Well, Duncan looked at the ancient 7 wonders of the world. He also looked at King Marsilius' tomb. He also looked at Napoleon's tomb, and he came up with this structure. He thought that this would include Grant among some of the great men in history.
Can you tell us more about how this site was chosen? Because our guest John Simon said that when this was built, this part of New York wasn't terribly active at that point. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, it was the highest point in Manhattan at the time. It was a quiet, serene area. When Ulysses S. Grant died, Mayor William Grace decided to donate the land space to the family. The family accepted. Julia thought that more people would come to New York City than opposed to other states, and she thought that, well, the building would be, it would not be crowded at the time because this was the only structure here on the land space.
You mentioned the association a few moments ago. Tell us more about how the folks here in New York got together to construct Grant's tomb. Start with the funding for it.
Okay, funding came from the community. The Grant Monument Association was formed 3 days after Grant passes. Prominent New Yorkers from the financial and the political community got together along with Cornelius Vanderbilt II and J.P. Morgan. 85 members included in this committee, and they wanted to construct a monument dedicated to Ulysses S. Grant. At the time of the association, Richard T. Greener, the first African-American to graduate from Harvard, was chosen as the secretary for the Monument Association. He solicited funds from the black community and also from prominent New Yorkers and citizens from all over the country.
Tell us more about Richard Greener as we see his picture on the screen here. Who was he and what was his relationship to Grant, if any?
He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1844. His father was a seaman. His mother was in the home. At the age of 9, his mother moved him to Camden, Massachusetts, and there he had access to public schooling. At the age of 12, he quit school in order to support his mother, and so he worked in the Boston area. While working as a porter in the Pavilion Hotel, he became associated with affluent citizens. One was a judge who gave him access to his private library, and another was Archibald Belcher. Belcher later became his mentor and his financier. Belcher financed 2 years of preparatory school for Greener, and he later entered into Phillips Academy, which is a prestigious school in Boston, in the Massachusetts area, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Tell us more about the overall funding, and we're touching on it earlier today. Tell us again, how much did it cost? Where did the money come from at that time? How many people donated money?
Over 60,000 people donated money, and money came from all over the country, and even from Monrovia, Liberia, $39 was collected. $600,000 was collected by the Grant Monument Association to construct the monument. Groundbreaking took place in 1892. President Harrison broke ground, and in 1897 the monument was completed.
So it took how long to build this structure?
It took about 5 years to build the monument.
And what is it made of?
The exterior is made from granite. The interior is Carrara marble and Lee marble from Italy. Some of the moldings, the more delicate moldings, would be also Carrara marble.
We are talking with Zyanja Wilson, a park ranger with the National Park Service. She is telling us a little bit about the outside of the General Grant National Memorial, Grant's tomb. A bit later, we're going to go inside and take a look at things. Zyanja Wilson, what is the history of visitation here? How many people come up here a year, and where do they come from?
People come from all over the world. Visitation is over 150,000 a year. People come because they recognize Grant as a Civil War hero, as the person who brought peace back to this nation, and just a simple admiration and a love.
We are looking at the front of the General Grant National Memorial, Grant's tomb. We took a look at the top of it from our aerial view. We will go inside later. Zyanja Wilson, what you can't see in that particular picture, hopefully we can, is that on the sides of the building, on each side of the building, are some, I guess, some mosaic benches where some folks are sitting. Can you tell us about that part of the tomb?
The mosaic murals were completed in 1972. It was done by Pedro Silva, a Chilean artist. It was done along with the community also. He was celebrating the centennial of Grant, establishing Yellowstone as the first national park. And he, along with community members, children and adults, got together and they made their own input into the memorial and on the plaza area. There you'll see 27 benches, and there are different features in nature and in life itself.
Got to tell you, our camera people just did a great job of wheeling their camera over there as we can see the mosaics. A lot of folks sit on those benches every day?
Many, many people sit. They use it for lunch space. Children love it because it's so colorful. And they're recognizing different aspects of life in the mosaics. You'll see the Park Service, you'll see Antarctica, you'll see things on the 60s, Taxi, New York City, many different features.
Can you tell us more about the surrounding neighborhood here in Upper Manhattan?
Well, the neighborhood is compiled of many academic schools. You'll see Barnard College, New York Music School, Columbia University, and directly across from us is Riverside Church. That was completed in 1930. It's the Gothic style of architecture. It's a very quiet area. It's a park. There is a park behind us that people enjoy.
And that's Riverside Park?
That's Riverside Park, yes.
There is also, I guess, Sakura Park, which is...
Sakura Park is across from us, right on the same property as the International House.
Sakura meaning cherry blossom in Japanese.
Yes.
It was named, I guess, for the 2,000 cherry blossom trees that were planted here in New York in the earlier part of the century. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We are going to continue for just a moment or two with Zyanja Wilson of the National Park Service as we take a look at the front of Grant's tomb. Zyanja Wilson, if you walk up the steps through those columns and walk inside, what will viewers see when they first walk in?
You will first be struck by the coolness of the monument. That's our natural air conditioning from the marble. As you walk further to the center of the monument, you look over, you'll see the two sarcophagus, Grant and Mrs. Grant.
We can see them. The camera's panning down below right there. Ulysses Grant on the left, his wife Julia Dent Grant on the right. You can continue.
Okay. I'm standing here in front of one of the exhibits also on Grant's early life, and it tells you a little bit about Grant's experiences at West Point, his military career, photos of Julia.
We see a large mural up on top. Tell us about that.
Are you talking of the one, the Surrender?
The one that when you first walk in, the one that's right above you.
That is the Surrender, 1865, General Grant and Robert E. Lee.
And there are several other murals that we will take a look at later. Zayanja Wilson of the National Park Service wanted to ask John Simon, though, our historian, about what the time might have been like here in 1897 when Grant's tomb was dedicated. If you were standing right here at this site, what would it have been like?
It would have been mighty crowded. It was a major event, like Grant's funeral in New York in 1885, the dedication of the tomb in 1897 was an enormous event. Brought out the people of the city. It brought out all sorts of demonstrations of respect for Grant and admiration for the tomb. One of the questions you haven't asked is why it took 12 years if everybody liked Grant so much. I suppose it's because of the wealthy people appointed originally to the Grant Monument Association board. They were looking for other people to come up with the money. That's the way they'd retained their money in the first place. And so eventually Horace Porter, who is really the guiding spirit, begins a public campaign that includes pennies from school children, money from all over, and eventually that's the way in which the tomb is built. And because everybody had built it, everybody was very proud of it. In the interim, there had been a movement to transfer Grant to Washington on the grounds that New York had neglected him, and that fell through, but it inspired others to take care of the tomb.
We want to thank Zayanja Wilson of the National Park Service for tour number 1. We appreciate your time. We're going to check in with you a little bit later to take a deeper look at the inside of Grant's tomb. So thanks a lot so far. Sitting next to John Simon on our set here on the plaza of the National Grant Memorial is Alan Ballard, a professor of history and Afro-American studies at the State University of New York, SUNY Albany. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. You just heard John Simon explain what it might have been like here during the funeral and during the dedication of the monument. Very busy, very active. A lot of people were fond of Grant. Why were they so fond of him?
Well, they were fond of Grant because he was really the epitome of America at the time. And I think they were fond of this man who wrote his memoirs. As I was coming down here yesterday, I made a trip from Albany, New York, and he had passed away up at Mount McGregor, up near Saratoga, and there was a resort up there, and I kind of could see Grant looking out over the Hudson, which you could from up there. Right? And you have this man struggling in his last days against cancer, struggling to write his memoirs because he wanted to save his family that way. And he such an outpouring of people wanting to know each day what was happening to him, how was his situation. So even years ago on this July 12th, right, in 1885, he was in the midst of his final battle. And I think it was this kind of determination of Grant, this same thing that today is, we're on the 12th of July, I hope, yes, and it was the same kind of thing that on July 4th, right, in '63 had brought the Union this resounding victory a victory which at Vicksburg, his victory. So the flags are up, and the same victory that day that had come also with Gettysburg, and that essentially saved the Union and paved the way for making this country what it is today. At a time when there was gloom all around, right? And when the Union armies had been beaten here and there, with Stonewall Jackson doing his things at Chancellorsville and the Union generals being defeated. Here this man, right, goes through the swamps up above in the Yazoo Delta, right, goes down the side of the river, cuts here, cuts there. No matter where he stopped, he keeps moving. And it was this plainness that comes through in his memoirs so beautifully, that this strength of his, this determination of his to do the job the best way he could do it, that's why they loved him so much.
Alan Ballard mentioning the memoirs there. There's an interesting story behind that, which we will get to later. Alan Ballard is here as a specialist on the Civil War expert. So he'll be with us for about an hour, and we're going to continue to talk to Professor John Simon as well, who will talk in detail about the life of Ulysses S. Grant. So we got lots of time for various issues related to the 18th U.S. President, and we want to tell our viewers that it's your time to phone in again. We'll get those numbers on the bottom of the screen for you. If you are calling from the Eastern or Central time zones, the number to call is 202-624-1111, and out west, 202-624-1115. Amelia, Ohio, has been hanging on for our guest. Go right ahead.
Professor Simon, I spoke with you at U.S. Grant's 175th birthday at Point Pleasant. I was one of the speakers on the podium. My name is Richard Crawford. I'm the historian from Claremont County. And I just wanted to reiterate a couple things we had talked about that I think people might be interested in, such as I always found it humorous that Grant, being from Claremont County and Monroe Township in particular, was defeated both times in Claremont County and Monroe Township when he ran for president of the United States, which is one of the things that people in that area always overlook. And also, the day he was born, the doctor that delivered him, John G. Rogers, about 5 hours later, helped deliver a young man by the name, or a lady by the name of Mary Clark. And 23 years later, Mary Clark was Mary Clark Corbin, and she delivered a young boy she gave birth to a young boy by the name of Henry Clark Corbin, who became Adjutant General of the United States during the Spanish-American War, and it was an incredible tie-in. I also just wanted to mention that Grant's last visit to his home area was on May 15th, 1883, the day after he buried his mother in Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. He was last spotted in Amelia on his way to Bethel, where his dad had been the first mayor, to visit his cousin Samuel Simpson. And one amusing story I wanted to point out, in Batavia, Ohio, which is the county seat here of Claremont County, Grant was visiting Simpson Griffith, a relative of his, and while he was there, they had fired a cannon in front of the house to commemorate him visiting Batavia. This is while he was still in office. And something on the mantelpiece over the fireplace cut him over the nose, and he made an amusing comment that he had gone through the Mexican War and the Civil War, and finally, when he comes back to his home county, he receives his first wound as he got cut over the nose at that time. But I wanted to thank you for coming to Claremont County and letting us visit and meet with you, and this is a wonderful show, and we're all crazy about U.S. Grant here at home.
Thank you, caller John Simon. Anything you want to add to?
Well, I'm just pleased to hear from a friend, not knowing who's going to call in. Grant took a singular sardonic pleasure in the fact that he was not a hero at home. The home folks didn't vote for him for president. That many of them had been sympathetic to John Morgan when the Confederate raider crossed into Ohio. Grant took a certain satisfaction in it. He had a sense of humor. Maybe they didn't.
We'll talk more about Grant's military career in just a moment. Let's get another quick call in from West Long Branch, New Jersey. Go right ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
I live in West Long Branch, New Jersey. My son, Bill, is on the staff of Dr. Simon's the Grant papers at Southern Illinois University. And on the Ocean Avenue in Long Branch are beautiful statues of the 7 presidents who vacationed here in New Jersey. Dr. Simon, what did Ulysses Grant do while he vacationed here in New Jersey?
Well, thank you for calling. And it is a surprise. Really, he attended to the business of government as best he could. But Washington at that time was just miserable in the summer. Well, it still is for those who don't have air conditioning. And there was a great desire to get away. Even Lincoln had gone out to the Soldiers' Home. And Grant established a summer residence at Long Branch, but he was rarely alone. Members of the cabinet came to visit him. There were other people who were prominent in government. Congress was not in session. After all, it was the summer and it was Washington, so that he was free to move out of the city. It's so unlike the modern situation where the president is expected to be in touch at all times. But Grant did go back to Washington on occasion, and whenever something important came up, he headed back to Washington, attended to the business, then returned to his summer vacation.
We are live on the plaza of the General Grant National Memorial, Grant's tomb, located at 122nd Street and Riverside Drive here in Upper Manhattan. We will be here for a little bit less than 2 more hours for our discussion of the 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, as we continue with our 41-week series, American Presidents Life Portraits. A look at our crew people here. We got a bunch of cameras, a bunch of people helping us out, and we did get a lot of help from the National Park Service at this site. Alan Ballard of SUNY Albany. John Simon left off earlier as Grant went to West Point and did so rather reluctantly. As Professor Simon said, take us further down that line. What kind of soldier was Ulysses S. Grant in the beginning?
Well, he had his first real experiences in the Mexican War, and what's fascinating, at least to me, about that is that here he was he came in contact with, here were all these other officers who were going to be later on in the Civil War, right? But he performed well. He went on from Mexico to serve in various barracks, and then in 1854 he left, and he left the military. There's some talk that he had problems at that time with authority about various things, but he went into since we don't have that much time, he went into a sad kind of period of his career, and it didn't. There's some kinds of, you see these little reports about him being walking along trying to do this, farming a bit here. After farming and going to his father-in-law's farm, you find him working there, and then you see him finally ending up in St. Louis, and then finally ending up working for his father. And so that Grant, by the time the war comes along, which is when he becomes the real soldier. I mean, he was always a soldier, in a sense that, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, John, but they had these things about him. That when he walked into a room, he could be. You'd see this man, little slouched over man, and then the second they put a group of men in front of him, all of a sudden he had a knack of authority, and the men knew that Grant that they were in front of a soldier.
Ask John Simon to carry on that point, because he did serve 2 separate terms in the military. What was life like in between that time? Can you carry that
Well,
thought
it's
forward?
a very interesting subject. I think you're right. He was a soldier, but he hated being a soldier. He hated being a soldier from day one. He continued to have his doubts about it and his reluctance to serve, and particularly in the peacetime army, where you had to wait for somebody else to die in order to move up in rank. Something he talks about in his memoirs, talking about a colonel who drilled his men in New Orleans just before they left for the Mexican War. The old colonel was not used to being out in the hot sun, not used to all the exertion. He dropped dead. Well, now, everybody missed the old colonel, but they all knew they moved up a notch. It's important when a colonel dies. It's a move-up game in the Army. And Grant had moved up to the rank of captain in 1854. He wasn't going to move up again for a long, long time, or so it would seem, because none of his classmates moved up. So he resigned.
We have some pictures, John Simon, of a place called Hardscrabble. Tell us what that is.
Hardscrabble is the log cabin that Grant built through his own efforts on the Dent estate in St. Louis County. While others took pride and pleasure in having been born in a log cabin, Grant wasn't, but he built his own. And it was an unattractive building that was perhaps a promise of future days when it would be incorporated into a larger structure, as some were in that part of the world. But at that time, it was the kind of place that Julia Grant hated. And when her mother died and she was needed at Whitehaven, which is a substantial building nearby, they moved in there.
What were his family responsibilities at that time? How many kids did he have?
Well, he had 3 at that time, and he was going to have 4 eventually. He was very much a family man. His first son had been born in 1850. His second son was born while he was on the Pacific Coast. After he returned, his daughter Nellie was born, and then Jesse Grant Jr., the very youngest, was born in 1858. So Grant was very conscious of having a family, having to provide for a family, and having grave difficulty doing so. His farm went under in the Depression of 1857, and at that point he began looking desperately for something that would support the family. Went into St. Louis, became a real estate collection agent, the very worst job for Grant, who was unassertive and didn't have a streak of meanness in him, and that fell through. Other jobs fell through, and eventually he ended up not only working for his father in Galena, Illinois, but really working for his younger brother, Orville, and that's a humiliating situation.
In a few minutes, we'll talk about the next stage of Ulysses S. Grant's career. We're going to talk about the issue of slavery with our 2 guests, but let's take a call first from Iowa. Is it Ankeny, Iowa?
Good try, Ankeny. I wanted to talk about his speech in Des Moines, Ankeny's suburb, north 10 miles. He was in Des Moines 1875 speaking to the Grand Army of Tennessee, so apparently there was a lot of Iowa connections to those few Tennessee units that were loyal, and there was only a handful of loyal Missouri units. A vast majority were obviously Confederate. But his speech was something reminiscent of Andrew Jackson and also our current friend up in Minnesota, Jesse Ventura, all 3, of course, military men, and all 3 taking very seriously their dedication to the oath defending the Constitution. Grant warned that the next great conflagration, that was his word, conflagration, referring to mass slaughter, would be over either, in his words, superstition or corruption. And he definitely did not feel that there should be a lot of mergers with state and church. I think his successor, Garfield, worked very hard against tax exemptions for church property. And I'd like to hear your guests speak about other papers, other references that Grant made, warning people of merging religion and religious fervor with public policy. Jesse Ventura just refused to participate in the National Day of Prayer in May, and of course, Andrew Jackson was also a renowned president for refusing the tradition of National Days of Prayer.
Well, thanks. You want to take that one, John Simon?
I'd also heard that Jesse Ventura refused to participate, and my first thought was just like Grant. I'm not sure that I endorse all of Jesse Ventura's initiatives, but like Grant, he said he believed in the separation of church and state. And during his presidency, Grant proposed a constitutional amendment that would guarantee a separation of church and state. It was an issue which had interested him ever since he'd been a cadet at West Point and had been marched off to Episcopal church services on Sunday, even though he'd been raised as a Methodist in a Methodist home. He thought church and state should be separate. There are interpretations of this that point to Grant as a possible anti-Catholic in taking this stand. This is an interpretation I don't follow. I think he was a man of principle, and I admire him for his insistence that the church and state should be separate.
These two guests will be with us for another half hour. We're focusing on the war, Civil War aspect of General Grant's career specifically, so we hope you have some questions and comments about that. We'll talk more about his life overall. Our two professors, of course, make us want to tell our professors and teachers around the country about C-SPAN in the classroom. It's a free service that our teachers can check in on and find lots of material concerning our education programs here, particularly with the American presidents right now. There's the phone number that you can call. First of all, it's cspan.org/classroom, where our teachers can call and get more information. Again, it's free information about American presidents, live portraits. You can use that for your own lesson planning. And if you want to phone in, the number to call is 202-626-4858. C-SPAN in the classroom and our American Presidents series. Alan Ballard is with us here. Tell us about the second stint in the military of Grant leading up to the Civil War. How did he get back in, and how did he start to make a name for himself?
Well, again, here you have Grant at the beginning of the war. In a way, I think, John, wandering around. In other words, he knew, he begins making points of access to get a commission. He knew that, I believe, John, he could be a colonel in a regiment. He knew this. But he actually, you see him sitting in a room for 3 days, I guess, trying to see General McClellan, and he doesn't see him. No one will understand who he is. Finally, through the intervention of Congressman Washburn, right, he ends up getting a commission as a colonel of volunteers, if I believe this is correct, and as a colonel of volunteers, shows from the very beginning, because again we'll be here forever if we just concentrate on that tiny little degree. He shows from the beginning an audacity and a willingness to put people together, and a no-nonsense to the war. He sees that there are problems immediately in the Kentucky, Tennessee area, right? He goes into his first engagement at the Battle of Belmont, where he engages the Confederate forces. He shows his gallantry at that point in the midst of a battle, kind of sliding down onto a boat. He shows the ability to use naval forces along with that. And then in February, right, of a lot of confusion about who controls the territory around this place, he makes his first really significant contribution in the war, which I believe is Fort Donelson and Fort Henry.
Let me stop you there, get a quick call in, and then we'll continue the story, because I want to make sure we're getting enough calls in here for our viewers who are taking part, calling in from all over the country. We have a caller now from San Diego. Thanks for checking in. Go right ahead.
Yes, I was calling. In downtown San Diego, we have the U.S. Grant Hotel that was built by Grant Jr. I was wondering if you knew why he moved to San Diego and relocated here. And they're buried at the Greenwood Cemetery in San Diego. And one of the markers in the cemetery is for America Grant. And I was wondering where she might have gotten her name.
Thanks. Can you add to that, John Simon?
California was the golden land of promise, and both Ulysses S. Grant Jr. and Jesse Root Grant Jr. ended up in California. Caller's quite right. Grant Jr. built a hotel, calling it the Ulysses S. Grant Hotel. It's still open, and I understand it's relatively elegant. And America is his second wife.
Do you have a sense of how many Ulysses S. Grant memorial sites there are around the country?
There are more sites than one can shake a stick at. There are sites all over because Grant moved so much. He did not really have a permanent home. The longest the Grants ever lived anywhere was in the White House, which meant that Julia, in particular, was very sad about leaving it. She didn't know where she was going to go from the White House. And in fact, Grant does not even die in his own place. He dies in a cottage in upstate New York that Alan Ballard's mentioned already. It was owned by Drexel, who had an idea that if Grant died up there, where the weather was cool in the summer, it would be great for the tourist business. And in that sense, Grant was taken advantage of at the very end.
Let's get another call, and we'll talk about the issue of slavery and the role of blacks in the Civil War. Ackworth, Georgia. Go right ahead.
Hi. Is there any truth to the story that Lord Lytton told during the tour the Grants took around the world? It's included in the biography by William McFeely. And it's disturbing because it doesn't seem in character with Grant. Thank you.
John Simon?
I can't really say that I've done as much research on that as I want to. I do want to do more. It is true, it's a kind of scandalous story that is completely out of character for Grant, and I'm not quite certain where and under what motivation it originates. Wish I could be more helpful there.
John Simon, what was Ulysses S. Grant's view of slavery?
Well, it's a very interesting subject because Grant grew up in Ohio, where he could see slave-holding territory from his birthplace. It's across the river. There are Grants living on both sides of the river. Then he marries into a slave-holding family. When the Civil War comes, not only is his father-in-law a definite secessionist, that's old Colonel Dent, but there are members of the Grant family fighting for the South, including one who comes up to Grant after the whole Confederate Army has surrendered at Appomattox. Grant says to him, "Bad business, Charlie," but loans him some money so that he can get back home. So Grant is really between North and South, and among his wife's relatives is Longstreet, who's going to be one of his principal opponents. The Dents owned slaves. Julia was given, we think, 4 slaves by her father after her marriage. And Grant apparently owned one himself because he freed him in 1859. Freed him. Didn't sell him, but set him free. We have the document. We don't know why. We don't know the motivation. We just know that he did it.
Alan Ballard, take that a step further, the issue of slavery, the fact that his wife was given some slaves, and make the connection, if you can, to the Civil War and how he fought the Civil War with that in his mind.
Yeah, okay. This manumission of William Jones was the fellow's name. Yeah, I think begins to indicate Grant's views. Grant was, I think, we have historians talk about the whole sin of presentism. But you have to judge Grant in the context of his times. And in the context of his times, slavery was to him a matter of no concern at the beginning of the war. Right? He seemed to have the attitude, which of course was prevalent in the North. My purpose is to keep the Union intact. And as time went on, as happens with any person who's got any strength in them, his views change, and they change because it's fascinating. The war starts off, you see, with arguments about states' rights and the expansion of slavery, where slavery is going to be expanded into. That's basically what galvanized and started the war off. But it ends up with armies clashing, white armies clashing. But underneath, you have basically 4 million black people who, as Lincoln was going to say later on, right, were at the basis of this war. And as the war moves on, as they begin clashing, the armies begin clashing, and as Grant moves past Donaldson and past Fort Henry, and as the Mississippi River opens up, because on the other side of Grant you have armies, people coming down the river and the Navy coming down the river. As that river opens up, all around there are black people. And Grant sees them. This is his first, I think, kind of major contact with masses of black people. And you have refugees coming into the line because Army of Liberation or not, before the Emancipation Proclamation or not, right, the blacks see the Union Army as a liberating force. And he has early complications with this. He doesn't see that it is possible at first when the questions of whether you're going to turn them back or not turn them back, he equivocates on that. He sends some of them back, right? And then after a while he begins seeing he has a problem. And the problem is that the army can't fight, right? Or the army begins to feel hampered because refugees are all around. And the black people are seeing him as a force of liberation. Well, what does Grant do? And this is where I think his greatness comes into play. He's a pragmatic man. I've seen documents where he refers to black people in a derogatory way. He puts a Reverend Eaton in charge of the refugees. And even in his description to Reverend Eaton of, he was a chaplain in a regiment, of the job he was giving to him, he says, well, it seems to me that you have those, and he uses a term which I won't use here, but on your shoulders. But Grant had a sense of seeing people. He could sit down with an ordinary soldier, and the ordinary soldier would understand that this man. Grant saw many black people the same way. He put them to work as teamsters. And he began putting them to work with long trains of his army. And then he had certain people around him, Colonel Osborne, right? He has people around him who have blacks working for them. One of them gets a musket one day and goes out with some troops and comes back with four or five Confederates on a captured. Right? Grant begins saying, hey, I see various things here. What does he do? What he does is at this point, he begins saying, I can not only use black people in this way, I can also use them as soldiers. So, although reluctant at first in 61 and 62 to bring blacks in as military men because he had the same kind of prejudice that many of them did at the time, he did bring them in. And certainly one of the most important battles for me in the entire war is the Battle of Milliken's Bend in June of 63, where a group of ex-slaves just off of the plantation, just put into the army, right, with guns that they could practically didn't even know how to use, right? The Confederates come over and they're trying to break Grant's grip around Vicksburg as it's kind of clamping in. And these black regiments, 3 of them, right, ex-slaves, right, they stand up and they fight with bayonets when those guns won't work because they don't know how to use the guns at that point. They fight with bayonets. And with the help of the Union Navy in the river, that Union Navy backing them up, they send the Confederates back. Texans, right? They send them back. And Grant, in his memoirs, makes this beautiful little thing. He said, and I no longer had any trouble in that quarter. And when he made that remark, I had no longer had any trouble in that quarter, right? That is the affirmation, again, at this point, of his faith in black soldiers. So, let me leap, if I can, forward quickly. So that not only did he leave parts of the Mississippi Valley after they moved away from it, I mean, after the Union Army had to move its focus away, and with black regiments, including the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, but by the time Petersburg came around, by the time the siege of Petersburg came around, 1 out of every 8 men in Grant's army, right, was a black soldier. And when they moved into Richmond, there's some controversy who went in first, or whether it was black regiments moved in. He used them. He then said he was a soldier, and whatever prejudices he might have had, he had this sense that I will do. When I see a man that does a job, I'll let him do it. So much so that when someone asked him, you know, a little later on during the war, you know, what do you think about those black troops? What do you think about them? He said, they're as good as any troops anywhere. He said, they're as good as any troops anywhere. And his part of the motivation for the way he acted later on in his life was this sense that he could use them. There's one more scene, if I can just use this one scene. One more scene. Black regiment almost took Petersburg during the Petersburg campaign. They almost got into Petersburg before the siege actually started. And apparently after this battle, Grant came and looked at some of them, talked to some of them. And there was the troops themselves just got up in deep respect and great calm, as they said, because the general was there. So
want to get back to the calls and point out to our viewers that if you want to read more on this, Dr. Ballard is working on a novel.
Well, the novel is done. It's called Where I'm Bound, and it's about the 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry. And Simon & Schuster will be bringing it out next year.
Our second guest is John Simon, another professor and editor of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left for this segment. We're about halfway through this program, American President's Life Portraits. This is the 18th president we're focusing on today, Ulysses S. Grant, and we are live in New York City at Grant's tomb. Back to the phones for our 2 guests, Memphis, Tennessee. Thanks for hanging on. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, this is Eddie Latham. I'm in Memphis, Tennessee. I hate to take away anything from one of our great leaders, but doesn't history show Grant as being awful fond of the drink, almost to the point to where some historians might refer to him as being an alcoholic.
Thanks, John Simon.
Well, some historians have indeed emphasized Grant's drinking. It's a subject of which much is said and little is known. It may well be that Grant had something to drink, and more than a little to drink, in 1854 on the Pacific coast. But when he re-entered the Army in 1861, he had a reputation as a drinker. This was the old Army gossip, that his resignation had been forced. And everybody watched him at headquarters. Was he drinking? Was he not drinking? There was wine at dinner. Did he turn his glass over? Or did he have one glass and then go on? People did not catch him drinking. They did not catch him drunk.
So is there any...
They talked about it, and perhaps there was a problem. Now, Grant is a very tiny person, really. He weighs about 130, 135 when the war begins. He's not only fighting to maintain the Union, but he's fighting to gain weight. He lost a brother and a sister to consumption, which was associated with low weight. And because he's so tiny, it could be that liquor affected him more than it affected other people. But I tend to doubt it because women drink a whole lot these days. They don't weigh much more than Grant. They hold it better. So there may have been something about Grant's constitution other than that led to these stories. But as for the stories, we're not certain about how reliable they may be. Grant also suffered from migraines, severe migraines. And people who are incapacitated with migraines come out the next morning looking like they have been dragged through an ordeal and may be confused with people who are suffering a hangover. Anybody who has to retire to a room in the dark, have compresses put on his head, be nursed and so on, may be confused with a drinker as opposed to a migraine sufferer.
And you did answer the question that I was cutting in on there. Sorry about cutting you off there, but you did answer the question I was going to ask. Let's take another call from Philadelphia for our two guests. Go right ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, both of my questions have been answered earlier. I was going to ask what was Grant's regard for black troops, and that was answered, and you answered in part my question about Grant's drinking. I was wondering what he drank, if he was a heavy drinker. I do have a third question.
Why don't you ask the third question?
The third question is, I heard a story that Lee requested of Grant that no black troops be present at Appomattox during the surrender. I was wondering if that was true.
Let's ask Alan Ballard that question. As we take a look at Appomattox, we have some pictures on our screen. Go ahead.
I don't know the answer to that. I do, but I don't know. John, do you know?
I don't think it was an issue there. What is really interesting at Appomattox, if I say a word here, is that one of the people present in the parlor is a very dark-skinned person, but it's Eli Parker, a Seneca Indian, and it is reported that Lee went in, saw that dark skin, wondered if Grant had in fact brought a black man to humiliate him, and then Lee realized who it was, went up to him, shook his hand, said, "I'm glad to see there's one real American here," and Parker said, "We're all Americans," which is pretty good.
That's right. And Grant was, I knew so much, I think it was so fond. Grant's attitude towards black troops, I believe it was at Lincoln's funeral, he actually saw to it that a black regiment was sent up on purpose to be there. So, that I don't, about Appomattox I don't.
Let's get one more call in for our guest before we take a break. Bainbridge Island, Washington. Hello.
Hello.
Go right ahead.
I have a 2-volume set here of the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. This was originally the property of my great-grandfather, Nelson Bemis, who served under Grant. And I'm just wondering if they're familiar with this particular 2-volume set, was published in 1885 by Charles Webster, dedicated in Grant's handwriting to the soldiers and sailors of America. Do you have any information further on this?
John Simon?
And how many might be in existence or anything like that?
Let's hear from John Simon.
There are a great number of them in existence because this was the bestseller of the day. Soldiers bought it as a tribute of respect to the man who wrote it. Even people who were unbookish and unaccustomed to buying books bought this on subscription because they knew that the profits would support the Grant family. It was their way of doing a charitable deed. Now that inscription in the front that's in Grant's handwriting is in fact in his handwriting, but the book was published after Grant was dead, and this is a facsimile. It is a copy of the inscription that Grant wrote out, and there is hardly a day that goes by without an email message saying, I have a set of the memoirs that Grant signed personally, so now I'm announcing on national television, no, he didn't.
Alan Ballard, one more question. How did General Grant treat his enemies at and following Appomattox?
He was he treated them like a gentleman. He had this trait that it's difficult for many of us to have. The battle was over. Let them go in peace. And that's what he did. He let the Confederate soldiers go home without humiliating them. When they asked, when General Lee asked, could they have their horses? He said, yeah, let them have their horses. They'll need them. The ones that own the horses in the Army, yes, let them have them, so they'll need them. And he said, as long as they go home, and as long as they obey the law, he said they'll be left in peace. And he, at that point, he set a tone for the post-Civil War period. He set a tone for the Reconstruction, which was a tone of forgiveness for his foes. Now, I happen to think that had major problems in terms of what happened to black people in the South as a result of that. But he let them go in peace, and when there was some attempts to really put Lee on trial for this, he argued against. He said, "I'll resign before you do that." So he basically was magnanimous in the way in which he treated his foes, and he believed that he was following the policy that his last major meeting with Abe Lincoln in regard to this had been transformed to him, or had been sent to him. In effect, let them go in peace.
I want to say thanks a lot. Alan Ballard is a professor of history and Afro-American studies at the State University of New York in Albany. Spent about 25 years here in New York.
Yeah, I love being back here in the city, and I'm really just so happy to have been here this morning with you, and I certainly have, you know, it's important that Grant be seen as the person that Grant was, and that is that at a time when they couldn't find another soldier, when Lincoln couldn't find anybody who could whip the Confederates, and here he came on and did what he did.
Appreciate your time. We are going to continue on for about another hour. John Simon is going to stay with us. We're going to take a brief break and then be back for a tour inside Grant's tomb here in New York, and we're going to meet the great-great-grandson of Ulysses S. Grant. But we're going to take a break now. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Well, you've been listening to a campaign march called General Grant's Quick Step. It was composed for the Ulysses Grant presidential campaign in 1868 by Edward Mack, a blind organist from Philadelphia. On your screen in the background is the George Washington Bridge. Right in front here is Grant's tomb, officially named the General Grant National Memorial. This picture taken from atop the Riverside Church, which sits just behind us to the right. Just a little bit. Again, we are in Upper Manhattan at Riverside Drive and 122nd Street. Earlier today, we took a tour of the outside of Grant's tomb, learned all about the construction, the fundraising. Zianja Wilson of the National Park Service helped us out outside. She is now inside the General Grant National Memorial. Good morning again.
Good morning.
Thanks for helping us through this. Where exactly are you now? And show us around a little bit.
I'm in the interior of the building. I'm standing in front of one of the 4 exhibits that tell you about Grant's early life. It shows you a little bit about his West Point experience, Mexican-American War, and about the home he constructed, Hardscrabble.
That's one of 4 major displays there. Keep going, because we're going to ask you to walk around the room just a little bit.
Regimental flags, United States flag. Another exhibit on the Civil War, his first win, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson. Behind me, the flag room, the map room, 16 flags, national flags, regimental flags, battle maps that shows you the areas the battles were fought in. The star indicates Grant was present.
When did all these displays go in there? At the very beginning, when it was first dedicated?
Well, the exhibits that you see here now were placed in the building in 1997, bicentennial, at the dedication, the rededication of the monument. And so these are all new, more elaborate information about Grant's life.
So aside from the sarcophagus, which we'll see in a moment, what else was in there for those 100 years before the rededication?
Well, the maps were definitely here. They were done by Dean Fawcett, and as I mentioned, shows you where the battles are. There were flags that was in the reliquary room, 16 flags that was given at the dedication in 1897. And these were flags that were carried into battle by the many, many soldiers that fought in the war. So that was here. But these are totally new flags and maps also. The map was revealed.
Just want to let you know, we had a little bit of breakup with our video signal, so we're continuing right now, Zianja, to look at the outside of the building, but we want to ask you some questions. We may have covered this before, but for the benefit of our viewers who didn't see the earlier part of the program, how many visitors come here each year?
Over 150,000 visitors come every year.
And is there a cost to get in?
It's free.
Is it a self-guided tour?
It's a self-guided tour. Some people just want to come in and just view the exhibits on their own. Some folks require a tour. We have tours on the hour, and upon request, you are given a tour.
Going back inside now to Zianja Wilson, what is in front of you? We see a box with some displays in that. What's that?
Yes, I'm standing in front of the surgeon's exhibit, and so you will see utensils and also remedies that were used during the war. It gives you an explanation on the diseases that the men suffered throughout the wars and some of the remedies that was used and the different methods, leeching, quinine, and so forth, that was given to the soldiers.
We're not going to ask you necessarily to walk all the way across the room, but as we look to your right, to our left, what else are we going to see in that whole room there?
You will also see a copy of Grant's memoirs and the stylus that he used that was said to write the book itself. You'll also see memorabilia that was collected throughout the years and was donated to the Park Service by collectors. You'll see programs from the first dedication, and you also see programs from the rededication. You'll see an exhibit on Richard T. Greener, and you'll see also, as I mentioned, programs and also names of people who donated funds to the first Grant Monument Association.
We wanted See if we can get a picture of some of the mosaic murals that are on top of the building there on the inside. How many are there and what do they depict?
There are 3 mosaic murals and they're depicting 3 of the more famous battles. You will see Chattanooga, 1863, General Grant and General Thomas. You will see Vicksburg, 1863, the taking of the Mississippi. You will see the surrender, Appomattox Courthouse, 1865, which is Grant and Robert E. Lee.
And just below you, there is sort of a rim around you, and as we look down toward the bottom, we see the actual burial site, the sarcophagus. Tell us about that.
There are 2 sarcophagus, General Grant and his wife. They're both 8.5 tons in weight. The bodies are inside. They're made from red granite marble from Wisconsin. Surrounding the sarcophagus, sort of standing guard, you will see 5 busts, and the busts are his generals. You'll see Sherman, Sheridan, McPherson, Thomas, and Ord, and so these were his most trusted generals.
And can folks go down to that actual site, or do they?
Yes, you can. You can walk around the crypt area to get a better view of the sarcophagus.
How long should people plan to spend if they, time-wise, if they come up to Grant's tomb?
Well, the amount of time varies, but you can stay an hour, 2 hours, and just absorb the whole atmosphere of the monument.
How do they get up there? Is there a subway or parking, or?
The number 1 train comes to 125th Street or 116th Street. There is parking on certain days, but it's easy access. The trains, there's the M5 bus that also comes to the Broadway area, and the M104 bus also.
And what are the hours of operation?
We are open from 9 to 5. Tours are given from 9 to 4 on the hour.
Zianja Wilson of the National Park Service, thank you very much for the tour inside. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, and there is a number on the screen there, 212-666-1640, if you want to call the General Grant National Memorial. Again, we are here live in Upper Manhattan, New York City. The specific address is Riverside Drive and 122nd Street. We are going to continue with our C-SPAN series, American Presidents' Life Portraits. Ulysses S. Grant today, Rutherford B. Hayes next week, and we'll carry on right through President Bill Clinton, the 41st President of the United States. Professor John Simon has been with us all morning. He's going to continue to take more calls. We're going to focus specifically now on the end of Grant's presidency and his post-presidency. We do want to remind viewers that this is your chance to phone in with your questions and comments for our guest, John Simon. We'll put those numbers on the screen again. 624-1111. In the Eastern and Central time zones, the area code is 202, and 624-1115 out west. John Simon, before we go back to the phones, tell us about the ending of Grant's presidency and what it was like.
Grant left the White House in 1877. It was following the contested election, the Hayes-Tilden election, during which Grant had to preside in such a way that the country would not be torn apart by those who insisted, on the one hand, that Hayes had been elected, and on the other hand, that Tilden, the Democrat, had been elected. It was essentially resolved in favor of Hayes, of course, as we know, but Grant managed to preside in such a way that there was a threat of bloodshed, but no actual bloodshed involved. Then he went on a tour of the world. It lasted more than 2 years. He went first to Europe, from there to Egypt, back to Europe, to Russia, to India, to China, to Japan, returning via San Francisco. And
how was he received around the world?
He was received like royalty. He was the most notable American of the day. Kings, emperors, chancellors were thrilled to have the opportunity to meet General Grant. And in particular, Otto von Bismarck was thrilled until Grant told him, "I never went into the army except with regret, and I never left it except with pleasure." He was distinctly unmilitary. He avoided military reviews and all the rest of the military trappings that meant so much to these foreigners. But he won new friends for the country, and Walt Whitman wrote a poem celebrating his tour around the world. He's kind of the poet laureate of the Grant years.
Back to the phones for John Simon. New York City, right here in New York. Go right ahead.
Hi, Josephine Fagley. I'm on West 107th Street. I just want to make a few corrections to your geography. First of all, Yeshiva University is not in the area. I think you mean Jewish Theological Seminary. Yeshiva's on 181st Street. And
Go right ahead.
Avenue.
Keep going.
Okay. Secondly, both the M4 and the M104 go up Broadway, and the M5 goes up Riverside Drive. So you have 3 buses you can take. Now,
Thank you for that.
may I ask a question?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. I've been trying for 3 presidents to get through.
Glad you did.
As someone born in Lancaster, I had a question about Buchanan. Namely, I read someplace or heard someplace that the first Japanese delegation to the United States was received at Buchanan's home, Wheatland. Does Mr. Simon know anything about that?
Can you add anything to that?
I am a fount of ignorance on that subject, and I'm sorry.
Thanks for calling. Caller Teaneck, New Jersey has been hanging on. Hello, Teaneck.
Yes, hello.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Simon or possibly for Professor Ballard. And this concerns Grant's issuing of the Tennessee Directive number 11. I'm sure Professor Simon knows this infamous paper in which Grant asked that the Jewish people be cleared of the state of Tennessee. Sounds like an ethnic cleansing. He also spoke of Jewish peddlers. Now, I'm surprised that Grant, in whatever else he was as a general, did not show some particular kindness in that direction, considering that there were many Jews who served with distinction, including receiving the Medal of Honor in the first group, nominated by President Lincoln and bestowed by President Andrew Johnson.
Caller, thank you. John Simon, you want to respond to that?
It's absolutely true that in December 1862, Grant issued orders expelling the Jews as a class. That's the way he put it. It was inaccurate. From the Department of the Tennessee. That doesn't mean the state of Tennessee. That means the entire department that stretches from occupied areas in Mississippi all the way up through Kentucky into Paducah. And it was an act of extreme prejudice and extreme ignorance, of which Grant in time came to be deeply ashamed. So ashamed that he doesn't mention it in his memoirs and doesn't speak of it later on. He had been falling prey to the anti-Semitism of the day. He'd been absorbing it from other sources, such as General Sherman, and he had come to speak of the Jews as representing only a commercial interest and only an interest in trading in cotton. Then finally, as the last straw, his own father, Jesse, went in partnership with Jewish merchants of Cincinnati to use his influence to enrich them through the cotton trade. And at that point, Grant should certainly have expelled his father from the department, but instead struck out in the wrong direction through some sort of a psychological sleight of hand. But it was a disgraceful act, and I'm glad it came up.
You mentioned the memoirs. We'll talk more about that a little bit later, along with some scandals in the administration that we read about. Let's get a call from Riverside, California, as we take a look at some tourists inside Grant's tomb. Go ahead, Riverside.
Yes, I was born and brought up in New York, but I've lived in California for 30 years, and my question is this. What did Grant think of Sherman's March to the Sea, where he destroyed cities and towns, women and children's homes at that time? I think it's a total disgrace.
Thanks. John Simon?
It is still considered a total disgrace in Georgia that General Sherman passed through, and did so in a way that destroyed a great deal of property. Sherman believed in making war so terrible that the Southerners would come to abandon it. Along the route of Sherman's march, despite all that talk about an orgy of destruction, we see many fine old plantation homes dating from before the Civil War. And if you tour those homes, you're told, well, before the war, Sherman was in love with the daughter of that family. There are just too many houses for that. Sherman did not have enough energy to love all those women, and it is a reflection of the fact that Sherman was not more destructive than he needed to be in order to accomplish this march to the sea. As for Grant's attitude, he approved. He had given permission for the march to the sea, not necessarily for the destruction, but he had also ordered the destruction of crops in the field in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, which had been the granary of the Confederacy. There needed to be an end to the war, and the war would not end as long as people fought. It was profitable to continue. Sherman took resistance out of Georgia as Grant took it out of the Shenandoah Valley, and the result was the reunification of the United States.
What kind of relationship did Grant have with President Lincoln?
Grant had a tangled relationship with President Lincoln. Lincoln was eager to bring in a general who would win the war, but not a general who'd run against him for political office. And before he brought Grant to Washington, he required guarantees from Grant's friends that this was a non-political man, that he would never run for presidency, at least then. And at the same time, Grant was concerned that if he came to Washington, he would have to take orders directly from the president and from Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. He wanted to have a degree of freedom. And so the two of them met on an edgy basis in March of 1864. Eventually these issues were resolved, and that relationship became much stronger. Really, Lincoln had no cause for apprehension in 1864, because in 1868, Grant still didn't want to be president.
Let's get a call from Groton, Massachusetts for John Simon. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
I heard that Grant's second son, Ulysses Jr., got himself into a Wall Street brokerage firm, and Grant, the former president, invested his money into it and lost all of it. Can you just touch on that?
Grant's later years.
Yes, indeed. This is the celebrated firm of Grant and Ward. It's in New York City. The Grant in the firm is Ulysses S. Grant Jr., as the caller already knew, and Grant himself was a silent partner. Grant knew very little about finance. Grant Jr., who was always called Buck, apparently didn't know much more, but Ward knew a whole lot about finance, and he knew a whole lot about pyramid schemes, and he knew how to inveigle people into investing, telling them later they'd have made an enormous profit. Do you want your money now, or do you want it to ride and get even more enormous? And most people said yes and urged their friends to invest. Eventually the whole thing collapsed in 1884, to the mortification of Grant, to the ruination of the Grant family, and to a period of great embarrassment that Grant recovers from only by writing his memoirs.
And that left him very poor prior to the memoirs.
He had no money whatsoever.
So Mark Twain comes along, and what happens?
As Grant began to write his memoirs, Mark Twain, who admired Grant above all other human beings, including Mark Twain, and who believed that all publishers were thieves, came along with a proposal to publish Grant's memoirs, saying that he would either pay a stated amount of royalty or 70% of the profits. Grant said, I'll take the latter deal, because you may not make any money, nobody's going to want my memoirs, and then you won't lose anything. Well, it was an enormous bestseller, and the Grant family profited to an estimated $500,000, which was real money in those days. Grant, through that final struggle to write his memoirs as he was dying of cancer, managed to think of his family first, managed to preserve his life, The doctors had despaired in April. He lived until July because he hadn't finished the memoirs. It's an act of courage and determination. And the memoirs, I should add, are of great and classic American literature.
And we just saw a picture of President Grant, a photograph, I guess in 1884 or 85. He has a blanket around him writing.
That would be
memoirs.
85.
How did he die?
He died of cancer. It was probably associated with the cigar habit that he had picked up in 1862. And he puffed on cigars vigorously through the Civil War and into the White House years. Grant died a painful and horrible death of cancer because so many other American families have been touched by cancer. They identified with Grant's struggle to finish his work before he died.
We're going to take some more calls for John Simon, and maybe in about 5 or 10 minutes we're going to meet the great-great-grandson of Ulysses S. Grant. Dana Point, California, are you there? Dana Point is not there. We have a call from Philadelphia. Are you there?
Yes.
Go ahead, Philadelphia.
Dr. Simon, I was wondering if you could give us some information on, when Grant died in 1885, he was considered a great hero, and his reputation has since suffered, and I was wondering if you could shed some light on that.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question. When the first presidential poll among professional historians was taken in 1948, Grant was second from the bottom. He has been in other polls ranked low. He is, I suppose, at least moving up slightly, but only because of Nixon and other presidents who are crowding in underneath him.
Let me ask you why second from the bottom.
The problem is, first of all, that Grant's administration was associated with scandal. There had been a generation that grew up in the earlier part of the 20th century that resented Grant because he had upheld Reconstruction, that he had persisted in the foolish belief that blacks could be citizens and voters. And then, beginning with the 60s, the pendulum began to turn. The pendulum rocked away from that, and Grant was criticized for not having done more to ensure that the civil rights goals of the 60s had been met in the 1860s. Grant was, at the time he was inaugurated president, the greatest hero in the United States, and people expected great things of him. People did not expect great things of other presidents of the United States, who in many respects gratified their expectations. But when Grant was not a president on a level with George Washington, the other general who had been a reluctant president, then there was an overreaction against Grant, and his reputation suffered.
Moving on to Clifton, Virginia, for Professor John Y. Simon. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Isn't it true that Ulysses S. Grant used immigrants newly immigrating to the country as soldiers during the war?
Is that correct?
Is that correct?
It is correct that immigrants were recruited into the Army. Those who had just gotten off the boat would not necessarily be drafted, and the draft is mainly a threat during the Civil War. There are, in fact, immigrants who come expecting to fight in the U.S. Army, expecting to participate in what they see as a crusade not only for the Union, but eventually to rid the land of slavery. And they are not by any means unwilling to fight in the Civil War. Furthermore, there is an expectation in the United States that veterans will enjoy a privileged status, as they do with Grant as he leaves the Army and enters the White House. A very interesting aspect of Grant, especially as it relates to those blacks who had served in the U.S. Army. Grant never forgets that many of his veterans are black, and this, in fact, influences his stand on Reconstruction issues.
As you know, we've been around the country these past 18 weeks and will continue to travel around the country following these presidents on our series, American Presidents life portraits. We like to tell folks exactly where our locations are. We are set up here on the plaza in front of the General Grant National Memorial, Grant's tomb. Again, it's at 122nd Street and Riverside Drive in Upper Manhattan, New York City. There's the street post there, and the building behind that sign there is the Riverside Church, a very, very large Gothic style building that was modeled after some structures in France 500 or 600 years ago. And as that shot moves over, you can see a couple of buses, including the C-SPAN school bus and our crew. Socorro Park is along the way there. You can see the Empire State Building. This is not live picture, but videotape. That viewpoint is just behind us, probably about a 10 or 15 minute drive to Midtown Manhattan, and we're sitting just along the Hudson River, New Jersey, on the other side there, and you can see the George Washington Bridge way in the background on the top of Grant's tomb here in New York. We are going to take another call here, this one from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Go right ahead.
Yes, good morning. How are you?
Morning. Doing fine.
I have two questions. The first question is it true that at the end of the Civil War, when the Grand Army of the Potomac marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, the black troops were not allowed to participate? And the second question is that had the North not won the war, what impact do you think this would have had on the world as it would have developed in the latter 19th and
Thank you.
the 20th century?
Thank you.
It is true that black troops were discriminated against in the Grand Review of the Armies following the Civil War. They had other honors, but that one was not one of them. As for not winning the Civil War, well, it's very difficult to say. It's quite possible we'll have two countries, one of which is a country that practices slavery, not having abolished it yet, because this was the reason why the South seceded in the first place. Certainly slavery would have continued for an indefinite number of years, in my view, though there are those who say it was on its last legs anyway, and the war was unnecessary. I don't agree.
What became of Julia Dent Grant and the grandchildren?
As for Julia, she lived for 17 years after her husband's death. She lived for a time in New York City. Eventually she moved to Washington. She died in 1902, and of course she was buried in Grant's tomb, as both Grants so earnestly wished for.
And we have pictures again from inside Grant's tomb, the sarcophagus of the 18th president along with Julia Dent Grant. What about the children?
The children, two of them became Democrats, but one of them became a general. They were independent spirits. Jesse in particular was an aggressive Democrat, but they lived long and productive lives, and they were great admirers of their father. Each one at one point saying, I always thought I was his favorite. Somehow Grant had managed to convey that to each one of four children, and they appreciated him for it. As for Julia, she was always devoted to the memory of her husband. She wrote her own memoirs, not published until 1975, in which you can see that pride coming through when she refers to her husband, speaking of her pride in listening to the inaugural address of my husband, the president. It is an aggressive kind of pride, and she's a lovable woman.
Ulysses Grant Dietz, the great-great-grandson of the 18th president, will be on this program in just a couple of minutes. We have a call hanging on from Memphis, Tennessee. Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing today?
I'm fine.
This series. Been watching this since day one. Yes, I have a couple of questions. First, I want to know what foreign policies did Ulysses S. Grant done during his presidency, and is it true that I touch on this amount? Read it once. Did the Hawaiian queen or king did visit the president during President U.S. Grant during his term? I don't know if it's true or not. Can you collaborate on me for me? And one more thing. Did Ulysses S. Grant ever visit Memphis, Tennessee during the war? If so, we have this place called Hunt Phelan House that supposedly that he was playing the Great Battle of Vicksburg there, if that's true or not.
All right. A lot on the table there, John Simon.
Well, yes, King of Hawaii did in fact visit and was received by President Grant. Most important foreign policy issue of the Grant administration was the leftover problems with Great Britain growing out of their authorization for Confederates to build raiders there. These ships had done great damage to American vessels, merchant vessels, and these had to be negotiated with Great Britain. Eventually, a treaty was signed whereby this went to arbitration. The United States got $15.5 million.
Let's get a call from Riverside, California for John Simon. Hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have a question. Grant had many nominations to the Supreme Court. One I'd like you to elaborate on is that of Morrison Waite, who had no prior jurist experience and was also another Ohioan. Thank you.
Morrison Waite was not Grant's first choice for Chief Justice. In fact, there's a rather interesting series of efforts to bring other people to the seat of the Chief Justice, including George Williams, who is essentially mixed up in scandals created by his wife, Caleb Cushing, who had written a letter to Jefferson Davis recommending a friend, Roscoe Conkling, who turned it down. Eventually, Grant came up with Morrison Waite. Morrison Waite, considering the difficulty in getting to him, proved to be a good choice.
John Simon, how do you think the country was better and perhaps not so better, maybe worse, as a result of the Grant terms as president?
It's very hard to say because so many of the initiatives with which Grant began the administration hadn't worked out successfully. That is, Reconstruction was ebbing in the South. It was more and more difficult to maintain the governments that have been set up under the Reconstruction governments. There is a problem with the peace policy. Virtually any mention of General Custer and Little Bighorn demonstrates that the Indians had not gone for the peace policy. And Congress had blocked his efforts on civil service reform. So that much that starts out so cheerfully and promisingly in the first term tends to erode in the second.
One more call and then we will have a new segment with the great-grandson of President Grant, Holly Springs, Mississippi. Hello.
Yes, this is Bobby Mitchell in Holly Springs, Mississippi. I'd like to ask Professor Simon if his collected papers of General Grant are on CD-ROM, and if he thinks that Colonel Murphy was treated fairly in Holly Springs and
No, the Grant papers are not yet available on CD-ROM, and in fact, we have no immediate plans for that. We do plan to have an experimental use of these volumes on the internet, and people are working on that, I hope, even as we speak. As for Colonel Murphy, who should have known better than to have been unprepared for the attack on Holly Springs, I think he got what was coming to him.
John Simon, we're going to keep you here and say hello to Ulysses Grant Dietz, the great-great-grandson of Ulysses S. Grant. Good morning.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Anything you've heard in the last couple minutes that you want to respond to regarding your great-great-grandfather's terms?
No, I'm just glad that John has his facts as firmly in hand as he does, because it's not my area of expertise at all, so it was interesting to hear that.
Well, the obvious question is, what's it like to be the great-great-grandson of General and President Grant?
Well, these days it's more interesting than it's ever been, especially because of all the activity at the tomb in the last few years. But generally speaking, no pun intended, it's it's something I'm continually more proud of as time goes on and the more I learn. I came from a position of rank ignorance. His descendants don't necessarily know anything about the Civil War and or about Grant's presidency, but it's something I get more and more interested in with time.
We understand you do a little bit of speaking on your great-great-grandfather. What do you say? What do you tell groups when you talk about him?
Well, I'm a curator by training, and specifically in the decorative arts, which is household stuff. So furnishings and things that people fill their homes with. So my interest in General Grant and his wife, Julia, has really been sort of from the point of view of what was the world around them like, their material world. What did home mean to them? How did they moved around a lot in their lives, and they lived in a log cabin, they lived on the frontier, they lived in the White House, they lived in Manhattan. What things did they surround themselves with, and what did this mean as their fortunes rose and fell through their lives?
Ulysses Grant Dietz, great-great-grandson of Ulysses S. Grant, educated at Yale and the University of Delaware. You said you work as a curator. Where is that?
At the Newark Museum in New Jersey.
In New Jersey. And you serve on the board of directors of the Grant Monument Association. I want to talk about that in a minute because there's an interesting story about what's been happening here in the last 5 years. But let's get a couple more calls in. We're going to keep John Simon aboard as well for this 30-minute segment as we round out this program. Manhattan Beach, California. Go right ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to say, first of all, that C-SPAN is a real national treasure, and people like Professor Simon and Professor Ballard are as well national treasures, and I really appreciate what you're doing.
Appreciate that.
My question is about the statue of President Grant in front of the United States Capitol. When was it placed there, and under what circumstances? It's very beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Want to tell us about that?
Oh, gosh. It's considered the greatest equestrian statue of the general extant, and I can't even pull the name of the sculptor. I think it's named Schrady. Do you know that, John?
Schrady. It is Schrady.
When was it put there?
Son of one of the attending physicians when Grant died. And it was dedicated in 1922. It was either described as the largest equestrian in the world or the second largest equestrian, and nobody's gone out to measure since.
Nobody's challenged it.
But it's a magnificent thing, and I like to visit it in Washington when I have a chance.
How does it make you feel, Ulysses Grant Dietz, when you travel around the area or the country and see those types of monuments and memorials to your great-grandfather?
Well, it makes me feel great. I mean, to say I feel proud makes it seem too emotional, but it fascinates me that those monuments were made because it seems so at odds often with the historical memory that we seem to be given today of what U.S. Grant was and who he was, that clearly he was a hero earlier on in the century, and the fact that we seem to have forgotten that in so many ways today.
How have you received your education on Ulysses S. Grant? How have you picked up all this? Through the family, through school? How?
Well, a lot of my education on U.S. Grant as the public figure has really been purely personal self-education in the last decade, as the condition of the tomb and the future of the tomb became a big issue in my life. But in terms of Grant as a man, as a father and a grandfather, that was sort of the legend of my childhood, of what a devoted grandfather and a loving father he was, and how good he was with children, and what a close-knit family it was. That was the sort of mythology I was raised on, because we didn't talk about the public world in the family at all. It was growing up I'm named for my grandfather, who was named for his grandfather, and he spent the last 2 years of his young life at his grandfather's side, and always spoke of that with great meaning. So that's the sort of way I was educated. It was more on a personal side.
Let's get a call from San Diego for our two guests. Good morning.
Good morning. I live in a building that supposedly Mrs. Grant and her children lived in San Diego. I want to know if you know any history about them coming to San Diego and living here.
Thanks. San Diego.
Well, San Diego was, Ulysses Jr. went to San Diego, didn't he? Didn't he marry in San Diego? And certainly there was a U.S. Grant Hotel. The family, there's still family in San Diego. So I don't know if Julia and her children were there.
Jessie went there too.
Yeah?
At some point, and yes, she did have some sort of home there temporarily.
Oh, she did?
But very briefly. Very briefly. So, who knows? maybe you're in the Grant House.
John Simon, one thing we didn't cover earlier in talking about the administration were the vice presidents of Ulysses S. Grant. Who were they and what were they involved in?
The first one was Schuyler Colfax from Indiana. A facile newspaper man, normally considered an intellectual lightweight. He was dropped after the first term and replaced by Henry Wilson. And Henry Wilson and Schuyler Colfax may have had some corrupt connections with one of the scandals of the Grant administration, the Crédit Mobilier, an organization that siphoned off the profits from the Union Pacific Railroad and tended to distribute to congressmen shares of stock, saying you could pay for them with the dividends. A subtle means in that day of bribing, but even recognized in that day as a form of bribing. The reason why Grant changed in midterm is because presidents did that in those days. There was no guarantee that if a president was reelected, he would carry along the same vice president, and Henry Wilson was a good man to choose because he came from Massachusetts and was an anti-slavery ally of Charles Sumner, one of Grant's greatest critics, and it was a way of bringing in a new constituency and showing that it mattered.
More calls for John Simon, Professor Simon, and Ulysses Grant Dietz, the great-great-grandson of the 18th president. Atlanta has been hanging on. Good morning.
Good morning. I want to thank you, first of all, for your wonderful series. My great-grandfather, Amos Aikman, was Attorney General in Grant's cabinet around 1870-71. According to family tradition, he was asked to resign because he desired to limit the grants of land to the railroads. And I just would like to hear a comment on this and to know if this is true. Thank you.
John Simon.
There was, in fact, that Attorney General. He did not last as long as he should have. He was a Unionist from Georgia. He was vigorous in prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan, and in fact even moved into South Carolina, went down there to fight the Klan on the spot, and eventually he did leave the cabinet under circumstances that I can't state with a definite answer related to the land grants for the railroads.
Ulysses Grant Dietz, there was somewhat of a controversy here, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, concerning the condition of this site. Tell us what's been happening here.
Well, the culmination of it was the rededication of the tomb, its centennial in 1997, where I was lucky enough to speak, as did you, John. And the result of basically over the years since the tomb had left the Grant Monument Association's control in 1959, the classic Park Service problem of having too much to take care of and not enough money to take care of it had really let this tomb, which had slipped more and more into obscurity, to be really deteriorated. It structurally had a lot of problems. It was not being well treated by less patriotic elements in the neighborhood, let's say, because it's always been an icon in this neighborhood, but it was being graffitied, it was being vandalized, it was just being allowed to sort of sink into disrepair because the Park Service didn't have the means to take care of it. And in the last few years of the first few years of the 90s, they managed to raise enough of a stir to get local and national appropriations of money to really fix it up as you see it today.
How did you get involved, and who else was involved in that effort to get the restoration going?
Well, I was an ignorant bystander at the beginning. It was a young Columbia student then, who's now a lawyer in New York City, named Frank Scaturo, who sort of blew the whistle on the problems at the site and the problems that the Park Service was having raising interest in it and getting money for it. Their appropriation was being continually eroded because visitors weren't coming here, so it was a bad cycle. And basically the Grant Monument Association, of which I'm a board member, sued the federal government. You might know specifically who they were suing. I lost those details, but sued the government to force them to pay for restoration of the tomb so that it would look the way it was supposed to look.
You have confidence that money will continue to be here to keep it nice looking?
I'm not sure I have confidence that the money will keep coming in because this is, again, the problem that the Park Service always have, is that these sites are political ping pong balls. They are not guaranteed because of their importance in any way. And for now, there's interest in the site. It's beautifully kept. The guards are here all the time. I'm looking for something like Jerry Nadler, representative of this district in New York, to reintroduce his bill which would mandate that on a permanent basis, and we hope that'll come through.
We'll continue to take pictures of the site here. There is a picture of one of the guard posts out front to the left of the General Grant National Memorial. If you're looking at the front here, that Mr. Scutaro that we just heard about made a speech recently. We will have that on later on C-SPAN. We'll get you an airtime. And of course, all of this week's General Grant, President Grant programming will replay this Friday at 8 p.m. here on C-SPAN. We have a call from Bellwood, Illinois for our two guests. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I have a question for Professor Simon. I'm aware that Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, before the Civil War in Mexico, were acquainted with one another. Grant remembered Lee quite well. Lee didn't quite remember Grant at the Appomattox surrender. But my question is, what was the relationship between the two after the Civil War? I think Lee died in 1870. But what was the relationship? Did they correspond? Did they talk after the Civil War?
Thank you.
After the Civil War, it was Grant who kept Lee from prosecution as threatened in Virginia, but they did not meet, except one time when Lee came to Washington. Grant was president. Lee came on railroad business. Grant said, "The two of us have had much more experience in destroying railroads than in building them," and Lee didn't like the joke. And it really wasn't the kind of warm meeting they should have had. At Appomattox, there had been an enormous tableau of reconciliation. The two of them had appreciated qualities in the other, had seen this as the beginning of a new day of coming together, and the spirit of Appomattox lasted right up to for the few days before Lincoln was assassinated, and could have been far more influential had it continued.
Let's go to Huntington, New York for our guests. Hello.
Hello. I was born in Riverside Drive, and I lived there up until about the late 1940s. And if you lived, I think you're located around 116th Street or something along that line.
122nd, yeah. Go ahead.
122nd. And when I was a youngster, I used to play in the park all the time and run up and down the area. And when I lived there, it was a very exclusive neighborhood. Now, I know the neighborhood went into some form of transition, and I know that places like Broadway and the in-between streets changed. I was just wondering, I suspect that it's still a nice neighborhood, but has the neighborhood changed radically, or is it still kept up like Columbia University tries to keep up some of the houses in Morningside Heights?
Thank you. Ulysses Grant, Deeds, how often do you come here? What do you think of this area now?
Gosh, I mean, I don't live in Manhattan, so I don't really know. I mean, I got off the subway at 125th Street and walked over here, and it certainly is not the exclusive monochromatic neighborhood it was when it was developed in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s, but it's still a vital neighborhood for whom Riverside Church, which is a hugely important parish church, and Grant's tomb are both major neighborhood icons and are profoundly important to the people who live here. So it's maybe not the same neighborhood it was when the caller lived here in the 40s, but it's still a neighborhood, and it's still an important place where a lot of people live.
Let's go to Charles County, Maryland, our next call. Hello.
Hello. My question's about Julia Dent Grant. And as I understand it, her father was Mr. Dent from Charles County, who had given up his inheritance here in the county to his tobacco farm to go out to Missouri. And in the family, my family, which is related to this Dent clan, the story goes that that's what happened, that he gave up his inheritance to a place called Dent's Palace, which was a tobacco farm, and moved out there to Missouri, where his daughter married General Grant. And later on, that when Grant was president, he brought the old gentleman back and lived with them in the White House. And they made a visit down here to Charles County to visit the old home place called Dent's Palace. And I just wondered if you could amplify on this and whether this sounds like a credible story.
Thank you. Either one of you can take that if you...
I mean, I'll go from my position of some ignorance. I mean, I know that Colonel Dent and his wife were married in Pittsburgh in 1814. So they were married on the edge of what was the frontier then and moved to St. Louis, which was in the frontier. And I've never understood why, except I've known about the Eastern connections, except that I had a feeling it was probably because there were too many people and not enough farmland to go around, which is what drove people west. And out west in St. Louis, the Dents had, I mean, I think Grant's Farm, I mean, it was called Grant's Farm later, but the Dent Farm at Whitehaven was over 1,000 acres at one point, and a very rich farm in terms of its land value. But do you have any idea of why he moved west?
Opportunity, I think, trade. He was ambitious, and I think he was willing to leave Maryland, but I don't have any details. I think you can learn more by listening on this point. But it is interesting that the old colonel lived in the White House, continued to say that the country had gone to hell since the Democrats lost power, continued to defend the South in all respects, and was much loved by Grant, by Julia, and by everybody who came to the White House.
Ulysses Grant Dietz, do you have any objects at home, items, letters, books, anything dating back to that period?
Yeah, there's some stuff. A lot of what General Grant had accumulated on his travels, especially politically related stuff, was scattered in the course of repaying his debts after the bankruptcy of 1884. And a lot of that ultimately went into the Smithsonian. But the family has things. We've got bits of china. We've got some silver. I actually have a walking stick that Senator Roscoe Conkling received as a gift from U.S. Grant and then passed down through his family in upstate New York to a neighbor of my parents when I was growing up who gave it back to me, so it sort of came full circle. So a few little things like that. I've got a copy of the original memoirs at home, and I have a spoon, one single spoon that has G on it, 1865, when Julia went shopping right after the war, and so things like that I treasure.
We have some pictures of Whitehaven, I think, one of the Grant homes. Have you been out there, Ulysses Grant?
Yes, just last year.
What do you think of the place?
It's great. I love that sort of crazy green color, which everyone assumes Whitehaven should be painted white, but it's that green that Ulysses and Julia picked out in the 1870s for it, which is quite startling and yet quite true to period. And it's interesting. It's a much more, from Julia's description of it, romantic feeling about having grown up there. I assumed it was going to be bigger and grander than it was, and it's archaeological in its condition now, but even in completely restored, it's not a big house. It was only about a 5 or 6 room house, and it was way away from civilization as us Easterners thought of it then. So it's a fascinating place.
Sarasota, Florida, our next call.
Hi, I had a question, actually 2 questions. One about the book Campaigning with Grant by General Horace Porter. I guess this would be to Professor Simon. In his opinion, he had mentioned a couple other references.
Mm-hmm.
Basically his opinion on the accuracy of the book.
Horace Porter's Campaigning with Grant is a book that's very much admired and should be. It's based upon, or at least we're told it's based upon, a diary kept by a staff officer during the last year of the Civil War, somebody who was very close to Grant and a very good person when it came to getting the details down. He may have embroidered at certain points, and he's been caught doing that, and yet given his skill, given the fact that he kept memoranda, this book is one of the best books to read to understand how Grant behaved in the last year of the Civil War.
Morrisonville, New York, our next call.
Morning.
Morning.
I was wondering if your guest could comment on President Grant's desire to annex the Dominican Republic and create a state there for black citizens in the South after the Civil War ended? Thanks.
You want to take that, John Simon?
Yes. There was a plan, and one to which Grant was stubbornly attached, to acquire Santo Domingo. It had a number of aspects. One of them was to make it a haven for blacks in the United States who might want to move there. Another was to establish a coaling base in the Caribbean, particularly in Sabina Bay. And there were other commercial interests involved, plus there was Grant's stubbornness in trying to carry through on an initiative of his private secretary, Orville Babcock. So the motivation is tangled, but the persistence is definitely there.
Ulysses Grant Dietz, how do you think history has treated your great-great-grandfather?
I think history's actually treated him fine. I think historians have treated him very badly. I was raised the way kids are in this country to believe that historians write without bias and from only the facts. And I've learned professionally as well as personally that that's just not true, and that there's been an incredible amount of misrepresentation of the reality of U.S. Grant's political career, his White House years, which I think was really exacerbated by the fact that he never defended himself, he never explained anything, and he never pointed the finger at anybody else, and therefore was the ultimate, the opposite of a Velcro politician. He was the opposite of a Teflon politician. He was a Velcro politician. Everything stuck to him. So that's been my feeling as I've read recently.
Let's ask John Simon to respond to that.
It is true. Grant's always been a controversial figure, and especially in terms of the presidency. There have been efforts to create a monster there and efforts to create a hero. There's a school that Grant can do nothing right and a school that Grant can do nothing wrong. I suspect the truth is somewhere closer to the middle. I've had an experience with a presidential poll not long ago where I was asked to list the 10 worst presidents of the United States. I was afraid that Grant might make the list, but he didn't come close.
Now, you touched on the scandals earlier in the administration.
Yes, I did.
What effect have
Well, they are well remembered, and they are credited to Grant. That is, it is assumed that because something happens when Grant is president, that somehow he made it happen, or that he is responsible for it. He is not responsible for what Secretary of War Belknap did, which was essentially to take money from people who wanted licenses as post-traders in order to maintain their status as post-traders. It was a scandal that involved the first Mrs. Belknap. It was a scandal after she died that involved the second Mrs. Belknap. And Grant accepted his resignation when he was already threatened with impeachment, and yet Grant was ignorant of this scandal and not a furtherer of it in any sense of the word. So, yes, he has been accused of participation in scandals, including Black Friday. No evidence really to sustain it. And yet, this is not the premier administration of the presidency. There is still something there that makes for a certain disappointment in Grant.
Last couple calls for our guests as we take a look at the inside of Grant's tomb. We go to Pueblo, Colorado. Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to ask Mr. Dietz if there was a piano or if there were any musical instruments in the household effects of Ulysses S. Grant at any time.
Thanks.
Good decorative arts question. In fact, very little of their furnishings, the large-scale stuff, has survived, but we have, in pictures of their houses, there certainly were pianos, because their daughter Nellie played the piano. Grant himself was notoriously non-musical, as many men of his ilk were. I mean, it's just men of his generation in America. But no, there's no surviving piano and virtually no surviving furniture that's come down in the family at all. Most of it was simply discarded by the family after Julia died in 1902.
Caller mentioning music. What else did he like to do? Did he go to the theater? How did he entertain?
He did go to the theater. He was a reader in particular, and one of the more interesting aspects was his reading to the family. When the children were young, he would read in the evenings. His wife, Julia, had crossed eyes, and reading was painful for her, so that she would love to be read to, as would the children. And many of the classics, including Dickens, were read out loud by Grant to the family in the evenings. It was a favorite form of family entertainment.
Last call, Chicago. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Hello?
Yes, you're on.
Oh, good. Good morning. You know, I noticed in his appointments a William Sherman. Is that the general?
John Simon?
Yeah, and one of his, I forgot what appointment this man served, but it said William Sherman, and I wondered, did he use any of his generals?
Thanks.
Through the Grant administration, William Tecumseh Sherman served in the U.S. Army. He was, in fact, promoted when Grant went into the White House because Grant had vacated his four-star position. But holding any other office under the Grant administration? No.
Ulysses Grant Dietz, final thought on all this as we study the history of your great-great-grandfather?
I'd just say I don't think people really know U.S. Grant, except people like John who really do know him, but I think the general American doesn't know much about him, and they shouldn't believe everything they hear and do research on their own. There's good information out there today.
I want to thank you for your time and coming over from Newark, New Jersey today to join us. Same with you, John Simon. You've been here the whole 2.5 hours. We appreciate your time and your help and your expertise this morning.
I've enjoyed it enormously. I thank you, and I thank all those people who called in with some of the best questions I ever heard in my life.
We thank our viewers as well for all their calls and questions and comments, and we thank Professor Alan Ballard, who joined us earlier today, along with the National Park Service, for making this visit here possible. Thanks to the local cable folks, Time Warner of New York City. And again, we appreciate your calls, and we'll be back next time.